Okay. Hello and welcome to the next episode in Series 3 of our UKRG Conversations. I would like to introduce Jen Kaines and Philippa McKenzie. Jen Kaines is Head of Collection Services at the Royal Armouries, looking after registration, collections care, conservation, archives and libraries across the organisation at the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds, Tower of London, Fort Nelson. She has worked as the Registrar and Collections Manager for over 20 years in a variety of national, local authority and independent museums, and sits on a number of European standards committees for cultural heritage. Philippa is Head of Collections Move Programme for the V&A's Blythe House Decant project. She is responsible for managing the collection move team, who are working on the largest collection move undertaken at the museum to move new collections and research facilities at the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in Stratford. Philippa has worked in collections management for 30 years, including 16 years at Royal Museums Greenwich, latterly as Head of Collections Management, where she worked on several large building and storage projects, culminating in the Prince Philip Maritime Collection Centre, which opened in 2018. Thank you very much. You've both agreed to answer questions on aspects of project and larger collections team management under our current circumstances. So we'll begin, if we may. So what challenges have you encountered in managing project schedules? Has it been a process of constant review?
Well, the short answer is yes, and continues to be, probably world without end, which is, I think, problematic for what I could call, career control freaks like ourselves. So, yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is, if you are, is to realise that everybody's in the same boat. Everybody feels terrible about this, and I think I started off by feeling completely paralysed by the enormity of all the changes and so on and so forth. But I think the best thing to do is to share your thoughts with colleagues, and actually, in the absence, if there's a vacuum, come up with suggestions yourself and try and get something down so that there's something to actually deviate from. Because I think everybody's kind of like bunnies in headlights about it. So I think the thing to do is just get stuck in, really, because I think people will thank you for it probably. I think the other thing to say is that for the V&A project, or for the V&A, 75% of staff have been furloughed, and we still don't have a confirmed date yet for starting back on the project. So what I've done is the sort of quick and dirty scenario based on 3 months before returning to work and 6 months before returning to work, and essentially just shunted all the dates forward, which I'm sure what everybody else is doing as well. This doesn't as yet, however, account for delays that might be caused by social distancing and different ways of working when we do return. So I need to put in a factor for that, and I'm kind of going 10% or something at the moment, just to allow for things like shift working and so on. So to add to my world of pain, of course, or our world of pain, there are two other museums sharing the Blythe House site. If people don't know Blythe House, and why should you, it's essentially a giant Edwardian call centre that was turned into a museum store in 1984, and it's shared with the Science Museum and the British Museum. So in addition to our own schedules, we've got each other's schedules that we have to work around. We're working obviously very closely on the project to decant the building together. But as I say, that does mean, so it's a double-edged sword. It makes it extra complicated, but also it's quite nice because you've got people that are entirely and literally in the same boat. Well, not boat, but, the other thing about furloughing, of course, which is painful, or just anyway, this whole thing generally, is of course that quite often staff that you need to talk to or members of teams that you need to talk to have been furloughed, and so you might not necessarily have access to all the information right from the horse's mouth as well, which makes things a little bit trickier. Yeah, I think that's what I've got to say on that one. Did that answer the question?
Jen, did you want to chip in?
Yeah, I mean, I think like Philippa, our project schedules have basically been thrown out the window since the middle of March when we left all our buildings. We're not much clearer about when our projects might recommence, and it has been a constant position of review, and I think those sort of what ifs planning situations and trying to take into account various complex scenarios. So if we're allowed to do this, okay, we could do that, but if we can't do that, then that can't happen, and then this can't happen. So it is just a kind of constant stream of I don't know. Yeah, best guessing, planning, and trying to second guess things all the time, which is really complex.
That leads me on a bit to the next question, I suppose, which is, will you have other commitments that are compromised after their originally planned completion dates? And what kind of other projects and elements have had to shift around it?
Well, so should I take this one first?
Yeah,
so
sure.
Yeah, I think like loads of other people, other than big projects, and I know that Philippa's got enormous projects on, we have a lot of exhibitions that hang around anniversaries. So, for example, our two main exhibitions this summer were Field of the Cloth of Gold, which was to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the Field of the Cloth of Gold, and the Second World War, where the opening was due to coincide, obviously, with VE Day. So we've missed both of those key anniversaries. So we're then talking about, well, when might we be able to kind of reschedule those? So at one point we were talking about maybe reopening the Second World War show, or opening the Second World War show to coincide with the September kind of anniversary of when the war started. But actually, I'm not sure that's going to be possible yet. Or at least we could maybe put the exhibition in place and actually not open to the public, because I don't know when we might open to the public. So, and then do we shift everything to next year, which a lot of international venues seem to be doing? They seem to be just bumping their exhibitions for another year. And then, of course, it's the same thing of, we just don't know when we're going to be back in our buildings. I think then it raises into question, doesn't it, the next year's programme. So if we're shifting all this year's programme into next year's programme, what happens to next year's programme? What happens to the work, you know, the programmes that we should be running and planning and kind of preparing for now that we would be doing normally, but actually we're not, because we're planning and doing next year's programme. So basically, I think our whole programme has been somewhat shifted in terms of exhibitions. I guess Philippa's is quite different, because it's kind of a stores move and project building, but our exhibition programme, I think, is going to look quite different for the future than we had planned or thought about in, you know, that our plan was for March 2020, you know, our 5-year programme is not going to look the same, you know, next March, definitely not.
I mean, for us, as you said, it's a big store move project, so that is quite different. But of course, we are still part of the V&A, and so there are lots of impacts around anything to do with accessing objects that are at live. So of course we had a whole programme of, well, loans will stop going in and out at this point, and so on and so on and so on. Again, you know, that's all shifted, but there are obviously the you know, huge impact on the exhibitions programme, which has meant that some things are being moved, some things aren't happening, and so on. And so you can't sort of, you know, even I can't sort of, you know, work separately. It's all part of the whole picture. We've also got some sort of mini moves in amongst the big moves. So we've got the main move, obviously, which is was supposed to happen in March 2020, well, finish in March 2023. But within that, we've got distinct collections or distinct areas that we're moving to, say, South Kensington or perhaps Neil Park or something like that. So of course they've all shifted as well, or they're, you know, potentially delayed as well, because they're, you know, dependent on things being built and finished in other areas. The good thing is that our big build at the Collections Research Centre at Stratford has just started. I mean, there was a delay, but it's just started back. You know, builders have started back there last week, so that's good. But again, there are obviously knock-on concerns about delays to supply chains and so on and so forth within the building world as well. So it's joyous, yeah. But yeah, so we're just you know, keeping on really, but and shuffling things around.
Without getting too, I mean, you don't have to get into a great deal of detail, I suppose, in any elements that might be confidential, but if you have other inputs like external funding involved in your project, how has this been affected in general?
Do you want to go, Jen, or shall I?
I don't mind.
I can go. Well, the decant of Blythe House is funded by DCMS, and at the moment we're looking at the impact of the delays on contract extensions, because most of the decant team are on long-term but temporary contracts, including me. So it's already impacted on some of the short-term conservation contracts, because we've got a conservation stream making the collections stable to move in the first instance, and some of those contracts ran out during the lockdowns. Of course, that work wasn't finished, so it's what do we do then? Do we continue, do we try and get people back, or do we just change what we were planning to do and make them deal with it via packing methodologies or something instead? So that it's that constant sort of thoughts about adapting how we do that, and we don't know yet what's happening in terms of contract extensions and so on and so forth. So and that's all I can say on it, really. But obviously it's very potentially very impactful. Yeah.
So I guess unlike Philippa, it's less staffing related, more kind of general costs related for us at the moment. So we have got various external funders on board with various things that are in the museum, and our development team have been kind of busy talking to them basically and keeping them up to date. Everyone's been, as I say, because everyone's in the same boat and we're all in the same boat, actually our funders have been very understanding. The difficulty I think will be, and that's great for those programs, I think it's that what we do in the future. So we, like all museums, will rely on external funding for all sorts of programs and capital works and everything. And obviously at the moment, everyone is focusing on funding those essentials. So there's obviously a lot of fundraising happening for the NHS charities, etc., which is, fantastic, and as it should be. But I wonder, and I really fear kind of where we are going to be as a cultural sector, in the future, and what we can do. Our development team aren't asking people at the moment for money because they feel it's not appropriate and right to do so in this current pandemic crisis. But how long that might continue and where our funding might come from longer term, I think is what we're kind of all more than slightly nervous about. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
And Philippa, you touched a bit on this in your last answer. So what has been the impact on the established teams and the project teams? So the implications for external contractors and project staff involved, and how they are preparing to continue with safe working, for example.
Yeah, well, as I say, 75% of the staff have been furloughed. There are things that we can, there are things that we are confident that we will be able to do, because there are elements that are more solo working kind of activities. So the audit, photography, barcoding, and object consolidation phase is on hold, and we've got 5 members of staff in at the moment, or not in, but working from home. We're keeping in touch with people via WhatsApp, but obviously we're not allowed to work, talk work, but we're just making sure that people are okay. And we are using the time to focus on collections mapping, and so mapping the collections from Blythe House onto the racking at the new store, and of course endless replanning and rescheduling, and lots of risk management as well. So we've got we've drafted we've got a draft COVID management plan for Blythe House that we're working on with the Science Museum and the British Museum, and of course that's all based on government advice, and anybody that hasn't, I'm sure you all have, but looked on the government website, do that. And we're creating risk assessments for each of the spaces within Blythe, because they're all quite different, and there are some really big ones and then there are some very small ones, and each are differently racked, so they're all very individual. And we're looking at routes, for example, in and around the building, using different entrances perhaps for each museum. Shift working to avoid peak transport times, because I think one of our major concerns is getting people there in the first place, and concerns around public transport, because most people are on public transport, and keeping people who can continue to work from home working from home and staggering lunch breaks and all that kind of thing. So the shared spaces at Blythe are the ones that are the most problematic, so toilets and kitchen facilities and so on. So we're looking at different sittings for lunch times, reduction in the amount of toilets that are available, which is going to cause queues, which is lovely. And again, one of the bigger things is how we will manage the more physical aspects of the work. So, moving large objects. And so, again, we're closely looking at guidelines, looking at PPE, looking at rearranging schedules so that we can reprioritise tasks that don't involve too much close working. And we're also looking at things like extra parking at Blythe and extra bike spaces and things like that to help deal with the public transport scenarios and things. Yeah, and in terms of external contractors, we're obviously working with transport contractors and so on, but we're fortunate in that we're at the planning stage at the moment, so a lot of that's happening remotely. And we have, we had a little bit of time to think about it. We managed to gather as much information as we could so that we can do that mapping and that planning stuff from home. So, I mean, up to a point, there are some things where you just go, oh, I really need to go and look at that, I can't. So you just have to, highlight that and move on. Yeah, did that answer the question? Sorry.
It did, thank you, but I was just going to suggest that maybe if I bring a question forward and address it to Jen, which is what advice would you have for balancing the staffing and scheduling needs across larger teams that are composed of diverse functions?
Yeah, well, we're at the moment we're kind of looking at the kind of practical aspects. I think, as Philippa was saying, it's those shared spaces within museums. I think one of the things that actually I'm quite lucky is that actually our team at Royal Armouries is actually quite small, so we have less people involved, which is good and bad at the same time. But just on a practical level, just thinking about things like our archives and our archivist, I mean, he works quite a lot on his own when he doesn't have students, and I don't think we'll be welcoming student placements back very time soon. So that's great from a COVID-19 perspective, but things like our technicians interact with huge amounts of other teams and across kind of working in the museum, which is presenting some major challenges for us, and thinking about how we might facilitate things like exhibition changeovers, because being small things, great, we can do that with one person. Big things, as Philippa was saying, it's those object handling moves. How do you keep a 2 meter social distance within a display case when you're installing a complex piece of armor? Well, you can't. So how are we going to manage that? The other thing that I'm kind of and is spending a lot about my brain power and kind of thinking about it and trying to acknowledge is being mindful about individuals' personal circumstances. So their family situation, their children, all of those kind of things. A lot of my guys are homeschooling and looking after elderly relatives and all the rest of it. A number of them have underlying medical conditions. Obviously anxiety levels are massive in terms of where people are, and it varies from day to day. So that's the other thing in terms of managing teams remote working, but also when we go back into the buildings, and I may not be there because actually my job, I can do most of this remotely. My conservators need to be on site conserving stuff, but I'm not there on a day-to-day. I won't be seeing what's going on, and I won't be there to immediately ask that question of and all of those kind of things. So whilst those practical things, if I can put risk assessments in place, I can provide PPE, it's that managing the kind of staff well-being and kind of, last week was Mental Health Awareness Week, wasn't it? And we're all aware that we all have good and bad days. And we'll continue to have good and bad days, but just I don't know how we manage that practically when we're not there to be there to help. And I guess that's the thing that is kind of encompassing my mind at the moment in terms of what can I do to help my colleagues.
When you I mean you have several sites as well, so what will change, do you think, in terms of your work with the teams on the remote, the sites that are remote from Leeds?
So what's quite interesting is that we do work across multiple sites, and I often, as I'm sure you know, David, kind of spend my time going to the tower and going to the fort. But actually, I now feel because we're kind of remote working, and actually we're all remote working. I know my colleagues at the tower and the fort have both said they feel much more connected to us in Leeds. So it's much more one organisation, because I'm seeing my colleagues every week from the tower and Leeds, because we're doing Zoom meetings all the time, which you never did before. So actually, there are some really good working practices. I don't think I need to be actually on those sites as much as I was, because they can take pictures, we can share them, they can literally take the computer to show me what's going on in various guises. So there are some good things that have come out of this, and that kind of jump between, I think there's been a reluctance, for very good reasons, for people to be remote working, and actually, well, why do you all need to? You should be all in the building so we can keep an eye on you. Actually, we can't all be in the building at the moment, so we need to be trusting our teams to be getting on with stuff, and they are. And I think there's a tendency, mostly actually with my team, of people doing more than they're kind of 37 hours a week in that sense, because they're so worried that they're not achieving and kind of constantly working, I guess. So yeah, I think there's definitely pros and cons, and I hope that some of it we will keep, because I think there have been some real positives that have come out of this as well.
Just to finish up, have you adapted emergency plans and procedures and risk assessments in the light of this current situation?
Yes.
Yeah,
short answer, yes. We've also at the V&A, we've got because quite a lot of the people that were on the emergency, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but are on the emergency call out list or have been furloughed. So we had to have a new version of the call out list, and include some people that include people like myself who are still working. And so so we've all been putting together our own little disaster packs and masks and gloves and so on and so forth, and ready to sally forth, and God forbid nothing happens. But yeah, and again, obviously updating all of our crisis management plans and so on.
I think the thing that we've noticed, so we did have a pandemic plan, but actually that was it was actually a short-term crisis pandemic plan. So a bit like, yeah, absolutely, it was an emergency plan for pandemic, but all our emergency plans, like most people's, are kind of focused on the first, we have first 24 hours, and then we kind of roll to 48, 72. And actually our pandemic plan was great for the first wee while, but actually we're now 10 weeks into this, and actually our pandemic plan it wasn't for that length of time. So we have been starting to rewrite and reassess, and do like everyone else, is that create COVID risk assessments, and we will continue to do those. But it's just been a kind of for business continuity and various other things, where you can't operate in the way that you thought you might. Our business continuity plans were, we all moved to another building in Leeds, but together, for the Leeds Museum. Well, that's not going to work either. So all of these things, I think we're all learning, aren't we, and have done, about things like both business continuity and risk assessments and emergency planning. So it's been quite, and we'll continue to update them.
Thank you both very much for your time. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Philippa. We'll finish up there. Thank you, everyone, for watching.
Thank you.
Keep in touch with the UKRG Twitter feed, website, and e-bulletin, and hopefully we'll join you again another day. Bye now.